Well, happy Thursday, and it is actually Thursday for a change, and I'm going to start sewing together and putting the backing and quilting the strip blocks that we have been talking about. I used the maxi stitches for the blocks, and here's what they look like without backing. Here's the front, as we talked about, with the maxi stitches. But on the back, it's just pure batting. This is called soy mix from Vicelina. Here in Europe, it's Vilene in some areas. But it's 60% cotton, 40% soy. So I'm doing this on my Bernina, and I wanted to show you first. I have selected my quilt stitch 1303, which is a 2.5 millimeter, but it has everything set correctly. But I'm going to turn it down to 1.5 millimeters because I am using a 75 universal needle with the 150 weight polyester thread, which is very thin, but it's strong. So you want really fine stitches with this, because then it makes this quilt almost indestructible. And the foot that I'm using my 97D foot, so I can use my dual feet on my Bernina. On FAF it's called IDT, but I took the guide off. So this edge right here is 1/4 of an inch, so I can eye it. Some people, when they're doing quilt as you go, will use the number 5. They call it, Bernina calls it the edge stitch foot, but a lot of people call it stitch in the ditch because it has this blade that's in the center that you can go down and follow your stitch line and do stitch in the ditch. But I need to do some other sewing besides stitch in the ditch, so I'm going to use my number 97D foot, which is the 1/4 inch patchwork foot from Bernina. There are many, but this one does not have a guide. So, and come on, I can't get the foot back in the box. Typical. Because Bernina has these nice little Barbie boxes to hang all your feet and everything fit in it, and then it closes up and you can set it aside. I usually just keep it in the very back of my machine. So we're going to go back to the machine here. See if I can get this straight so we can sew. There it goes. And what I have done is cut a backing for my quilt. I've cut it a little bit too wide and a little bit too long, as you can see here, for this. And it's held on the back of a quilt strip with 505. I'm using 505. I've also used Chatterbox Quilts basting spray. That is wonderful. I quit using it because for some reason here in the Netherlands you can't buy alcohol anymore, or it's very, very expensive and in very small containers. And I used vodka once, but also suddenly the cheap vodka has just vanished, and now it's actually cheaper for me to use 505 than it is to make the quilting spray. But the quilting spray worked really, really well. These blocks are 5 wide. So if we go in 3, the third block should be the center. So what we're going to do is put it in here, and then we're going to do a little and this machine is great. It has a thing called hover, so when the needle's down, the foot pops up just a little bit so you can turn. And it's hard to do this. It's much easier with the camera out of the way, but I want you to see how I do this. And like I said, it's just 505 stuck to the back, as you can see. I showed you the one. Nothing fancy here. It's just a plain. I decided to use a blue cotton. So I'm going to get everything in a... And like I said, I have a 1.5 millimeter straight stitch because I'm using a very fine thread. And we're just going to go slow and go down the seam here. And you noticed it popped up, so my piecing, I can stop and realign and do what I need to do. And this is one of the things that I absolutely love about my Bernina, is this needle is right here in the front. So it just makes it really easy to do any of this stuff. And it's funny, I'm not even in the seam. I'm doing another piece, so I'll do this and then I'll come back to the seam. Because what I want to do is quilt little boxes around these pieces. So, and you can stop and relay and stretch and maneuver your fabric to however it works best for you. When I first started learning quilting, I used a hoop. Just an inexpensive little embroidery hoop to quilt, and I would put my quilt sandwich in it, and that gave me a very defined area to sew in, which made it easier for me to learn to maneuver my fabric and to do other things. So see, and we're coming up to a corner, so I'll stop, and then see, I can pivot it or I can stop, but I need to get this quilt basted down. So I'm just going to cut the threads. I'm going to do a pattern in, so it'll do a knot and then cut itself. So it actually knotted this thread for me. So I'm going to come back over here to this seam, and here we go. This seam, I was at the wrong seam, so we put the needle down, and then I can put this thread. I'll clip my threads later, but we just take our time and sew in the stitch. And this 97D foot is perfect because it's a straight stitch foot. It has a small hole, but it has a little slit here for me to follow my line, if you can see it right here. And and with the dual feed or the FAF IDT, until I got this machine for Christmas, I would be using my FAF for this. But this machine is smaller and easier to maneuver, I find. A lot of people love big machines for quilting. I have found that I like the smaller spaces because it's easier to see and to work with and to keep lined up. Because quilting is all about consistency. Do the same thing over and over and over again, and every time you do it, it be exactly the same. So I have to stop and redo because it's pulling, so we don't want it to pull around the needle. And this is, like I said, a number 70 universal, but this is a titanium Gross Beckett, which aren't made anymore. They bought out Schmidt's, and now all Gross Beckett, what they consider domestic machines, are under the Schmidt's name. But you can get them with the titanium coating. Schmidt's calls them gold. And there's some plus and minuses to titanium. Titanium needles are harder. They last a lot longer than a standard needle before they get dull. But if you break a needle, it hits harder in your machine. But I find, for me, I don't break many needles anymore, but during my beginning days, I did. And I found that standard needles would bend, and they could put a burr in your bobbin case, especially if you had a top-loading bobbin, where you have the big plastic bobbin case. That needle could come down and bend and put a little rough spot nick on the edge of your bobbin case, which means you had to buy another bobbin case. I have found that titanium needles, even though they break harder, when they break, they break. So there's a plus and minus to that, because if you're not proficient with the machine yet, I would say stay with the standard, because it's not going to knock your machine. But a titanium needle, if it hits hard enough, can actually knock your machine out of alignment, which means it has to go to a service and be retimed. So we got to our end of the row, so we'll just cut our thread. Again, this machine is nice because it has a thread cutter. So we just pull it out, and then we can go to our next square down the center. And I can show you the back here where it's sewed. See the nice little quilting stitches on the back? How nice and defined they're formed for you. As you do this, and then in my center squares, because I wanted it to show on the back, I'm going to put butterflies in these big red center squares. They're 4 inches finished. And like I said, these blocks are 16. I was shooting for 20, but it was getting way too big. I didn't know what I was going to do with that big of a quilt. So we're going to do the next one. So and I've fooled around and pulled my thread to the front. You don't want it wound around your needle because that will cause you to break a thread. And you don't want multiple seams while quilting. So we push the needle down and see we're in our spot. And so we'll do another one. And it doesn't matter if you come off of this a little bit, but you want to be close. And you can even see right here, my quilting's not perfect. It's in the same allowance. So we do the next line, and we have to stop and realign and get it positioned. And one of the hardest things is I have a tripod arm in the middle, which is also catching the quilt, because I wouldn't ordinarily have to stop this much, but this is because I wanted to video it. But I mean, all major machines have these 1/4-inch foots and these straight stitch foots and things like that. But the thing is, with your machine, you have to experiment and find the foot that works best for you for the jobs. They have, 1/4-inch foots with guides, without guides. Some people like to use a regular foot and then move their needle over. Janome is good at that with their AccuFeed system. They have this big, beautiful walking foot built into their machines. And they use the big foot, but then they move the needle to the far right for your 1/4-inch seam for you to follow. And it has this thing called a fabric guide, which goes onto the embroidery arm, and you put it on there, and you set it to a 1/4-inch, so it gives you a nice big guide to follow, so you can line up yours. But I have a hard time with my Janome sewing straight. I drift left or right because the needle on the Janome is back here, and for me and my vision issues, again, we talk about the personal thing. Vision issues is that causes I lose the depth and I get out of a line. I can still use my FAF, but the FAF is in the middle. Its needle is about where the back of this foot rests, where this one is right here in the front. See, here's the front of here's the needle bar. It's only a finger width behind the front of the machine. So for me, it's very easy to look down and to sew and see. And that's a specialty with Bernina. I think Juki has it as well, but it's because they have these front-loading bobbins so they can move the needle more forward. Because like the other ones, you have to put your bobbin in right here, and these don't have room for that. So I love my FAF. I love the way it sews, as you can see in these quilting stitches, of how perfect they are. I've always loved FAF. I'm starting to like the Bernina for its size. This is 8.5 opposed to my FAF being 10 inches. My Janome is 11 inches. And it is just, for me, too big. For me. But a lot of people love those big, big machines. But that big, big machine is great for embroidery because it has you can embroider a 9-inch quilt square in there, where my FAF only does an 8-inch quilt square. This machine only does a 6-inch quilt square. So, and that's how it goes. So now we pull it to the back, and always, this is very important, try to pull your project from the back and then pull it around, because then it does not pull your thread back through your needle. So but here we go. We're going to go back here and see, we sewed over here, so we're going to start with this other one. I turned it around because we're just sewing straight stitches, so I basically turned this upside down as it was, and so that I have less fabric in my harp. So I'm always sewing from the middle out, middle out, middle out, middle out, which makes it easier to handle. That's another big thing with quilting. And see, I just also got caught up into the thread myself. So we take these and these blocks are easy to count because they're 2 strips of color with 1 strip of white before the center. So you have to get the quilt up on everything and get it all done. So we sink our needle again and we get it all straight and ready to go. And so we've got it nice and laid. But you could also have added the back. You could have put these rows together and added the back and then quilted the row so the quilting is on the back of the backing. That's up to you, but the problem is the way you do this, as you add your rows, the quilt gets bigger. So, you know, eventually you're going to have a full-length quilt. But the thing is, if you do it correctly, then all your weight is over here on the left-hand side of your table for you to hold your quilt up, and very little is in the heart. And that's how you can also quilt on a smaller machine. You don't have to have a huge domestic machine to quilt on, which, you know, and that's the thing. And these machines, and many of us have these big, beautiful machines that do all these fancy things, but we don't use them. And it's important to use the machine that you have and to enjoy using it, because it makes it worth buying them. Like, I love using the decorative stitches in my quilting. And it doesn't have to be these maxi stitches. You could have done an echo here, come 1/4 of an inch in, and put a little car or little rows of flowers along each of these 1/4 inch in. Would have been beautiful quilting as well. It doesn't have to be just straight stitch quilting. There are so many options, and you have walking foot, which this one has dual feed, which is a built-in walking foot. Pfaff has IDT, but I also have a walking foot for this machine, a traditional one. And you can use those to go across your quilt. But if you're doing a whole quilt at a time, little things that you need is you need lots of space to support your quilt. One of the things that I have found that is great to use to support my quilt on the side here, like the left-hand side while you're quilting, is to set your ironing board on your left-hand side and lower it level with your quilting surface. And this gives you an arm to rest all that weight on while you're sewing. There are just so many options, and you do what you can do. Like Seth has a straight stitch only machine, so he would not have anything other than straight stitches on his machine. But that's also okay if that's what you have. He loves his Juki straight stitch, and it stitches beautifully. And like 99% of the time, I'm a straight stitch only person myself. So it's relative. But Like I said, I chose this stitch for the quilting because someone was asking about the maxi stitches, and it was funny because I wanted a big bold quilting, which is very rare for me. I like invisible quilting, and I wanted bold, so I chose to use, like I said, a 40 weight cotton, and use these maxi stitches, which on the darker colors really stands out. Gives you a beautiful simple quilting on this quilt. And also, your quilts don't have to be fancy either. You know, if you like making log cabins, make log cabins. If you like making half square triangles, make half square triangles. Like I've said, I've never made a strip quilt. This is the first time I've ever used a, Benartex calls them pinwheels. Most people just call them jelly rolls, but these were pre-cut 2.5. And the reason I had these, I got them to try, and I never tried. I've had them for several years, and so I wanted to do something simple and quick to test out my Bernina, also to figure out how it stitches, how it sounds, because like this machine, when it needs oiling, oh my, you know, because it's like all of a sudden like you think it's about to blow up or something. You give it a couple of drops of oil and it's quiet like it is now. So that's what we do. And then one of the big things about the Bernina, which people overlook a lot, let me get it here to show you. This is the bobbin. Look how big that bobbin is compared to a standard bobbin. Here's a standard bobbin right here. Compare it. It holds. Like, I pretty much made this whole quilt using one bobbin of thread, which is great. I think. That's me. I used my FAF, and it seemed like every time I was turning around, I was changing the bobbins. Because the FAF, using the 40 weight thread in those bobbins, would give me basically 1.5 blocks of quilting using 40 weight. Ooh, I have a mistake that I'm going to have to come back and fix. Look at this. See, I'm not perfect either. I'll have to come back and fix that later. And there we go. We've basically now quilted this down to the back. We have a smooth back. Now I'm going to let this go. But how you would do this next for the next row is you would let me move the camera over here so you can see. You would trim these edges up here, the edges on this quilt. You would lay the next row right sides together. You'd make sure they're all lined up so the batting's on the back, but then you would add another row of backing right sides together, so when you stitch this and then it folds open, you also have your backing, and you'd use 505 to adhere it to this, or your quilting basting spray. I know in the US they use a lot of Elmer spray. There's many different brands out there, but that's And it's simple, and you go through and you do each one of the rows at a time, and then all of a sudden